This is the second part of our Bible study series on the Bible's case for Christianity. In the last part, we discussed the natures of and relationships between faith, reason, and revelation. And with that foundation now in place, we will in this second part begin to build the case for Christianity, starting with the question of God's existence. But for the Bible, the question of God's existence is really a non-question. And by this we mean that the Bible nowhere attempts to make a detailed case for God's existence, but rather simply assumes God's existence from the very first verse. When we go to the very first verse, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." There's no case laid out for God's existence. God is simply asserted to exist and to be the creator of all things. In fact, the Bible not only assumes that God exists, but goes so far as to say that to claim that there is no God is foolishness. In both Psalm 14 verse 1 and 53 verse 1, the psalmist writes, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." The fool says in his heart, there is no God. According to the Bible, atheism, the belief that there is no God, is a foolish belief. But how can the Bible take such a bold stance to not only assume without an explicit argument that God exists, but to in fact call those who claim not to believe in God fools? Well, according to Scripture, such a claim is foolishness because we know that God exists. A key text on this point is Romans 1, verses 21 to 23, where the Apostle Paul writes, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So, the concept of foolishness is directly linked to the fact that they knew God, to some extent knowing he exists and knowing who he is, yet chose not to acknowledge him, not to give him the honor or thanks which he is due. And this is key to understanding what the Bible means here by foolishness. It's not meant to be an insult or a derogatory term, but is rather a characterization of a particular attitude, a particular state of the heart. It's been rightly said that a person is not a fool for doing or saying something when they don't know any better. That's just plain ignorance. Rather, a person is a fool for doing or saying something when they do know better. And the Bible is adamant that we do know better than to say that there is no God, necessarily making such claims foolishness. Now, this of course begs the question, how do we know that God exists? Well, God's existence is evident to us in at least two ways. And you'll notice, thinking back to the first part of this study, that both of these ways fall under the category of God's general revelation to mankind. The first way in which God's existence is evident to us is the testimony of his creation. In other words, creation testifies to the Creator. We find this point discussed most explicitly in Romans 1, verses 18 to 20. the 3 verses just prior to the other passage in Romans we just cited a little earlier. And here we read, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." This is something they know to be true, but they're suppressing it. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Creation plainly, clearly testifies to the Creator. So we are without excuse for denying him. And our denial is nothing more than a suppression of what we know to be true. And coming back to the following verses, which we read earlier, it is this act of denying the God they know exists that makes the professed atheist, from a biblical perspective, a fool. There are other passages of Scripture, including in the Old Testament, that likewise highlight the fact that creation testifies to the Creator. A classic text is Psalm 19, verses 1 to 4, which says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." All these references to declaring, proclaiming, speech, knowledge, hearing, voice, and words all highlight the fact that God has spoken to us, has communicated with us, has revealed himself to us through his creation. And this general revelation of God to mankind is present through all the earth, to the end of the world. In fact, a creation's testimony to the Creator is so loud and so clear that the honest, objective observer cannot help but give glory to the Creator and be left in a state of awe and wonder. Psalm 8, verses 3 to 4 says, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" Now, that's only one way in which God's existence is evident to us. Another way in which we know God exists is through the witness of our conscience. Specifically, the conscience bears witness to the moral law and the moral law giver. Just as we can perceive with our minds that creation testifies to the Creator, our conscience informs us that there is a moral law which in turn testifies to the moral law giver. A key text, again, is found in Romans 1, particularly in verses 28 to 32. Here, again, we read, "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God," to acknowledge something or someone requires a knowledge of that thing or person. So it comes back again. They know God exists. They know to some extent who he is. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. We are here told that people know God's righteous decree, his moral law. And it is implied that the knowledge of this moral law should suffice for them to acknowledge God, the moral law giver. How do people know God's moral law? Well, we're given the answer to that question just a little further into the letter in Romans 2, verses 14 to 15. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Just as there is a sense in which truths about God's existence and nature are written in creation, so too is God's moral law written on our hearts, and our conscience bears witness to this. To summarize then, the Bible assumes God's existence from the very first verse, and asserts that to claim that there is no God is foolishness, since we all know instinctively that God exists, since the creation testifies to its creator, and the moral law written on each of our hearts bears witness to the moral law giver. So where does this lead us in terms of building our case for Christianity? Well, as we're going to see, since God exists, then miracles are possible and can be used to accomplish God's purposes, including vindicating a messenger and his message as being from God. And it is to the Bible's attestation to the reality and significance of miracles that we will shift our attention in the third part of this study. But until then, may God bless you as you seek to love him with all your mind.